For this class, we recently read World War Z, and so what I'm going to be talking about in this video is kind of seeing how World War Z measures up to mainstream zombie culture, because World War Z can be considered a postmodern work, and ideally postmodern work is going to diverge from your mainstream culture in any number of ways. But before I do any direct comparison already, I'm going to kind of take a look back on zombie history to see where things kind of originated from, to kind of put things into perspective. So the very first mention of undead in any kind of story is actually found in the oldest known written story, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was written around 2000 BC. So the story itself doesn't have a direct mention of zombies per se, but it does mention undead being used. But zombies itself came along much later. It was in the 17th century, and it was in Haiti. So at first, zombies were slaves who had committed suicide. The idea was that because they committed suicide, they couldn't move on to the afterlife, so their corpses were forced to just roam aimlessly. Later on, this became a part of Haitian folklore, and the idea evolved and became mixed up with voodoo a little bit. So the idea was that corpses could be reanimated by shaman or voodoo priests. Moving on to something that might be a little more familiar, one classic example of undead that sort of like zombies, not necessarily, is actually Frankenstein. That was written in 1818, and it was the idea that this monster was created from this compilation of body parts, which is kind of similar to zombies. But the first example of zombie literature in the United States was actually written by H.P. Lovecraft, and it was published in 1922. The title of the short story is Herbert West Reanimator. And so that's really where zombies first appeared in American culture. And actually, H.P. Lovecraft himself said that the story was sort of a parody of the Frankenstein story. So later on in the 50s, what ended up happening was there was the creation of zombie comic books, and these characters were based off of the short stories that H.P. Lovecraft wrote. Also developed in the 50s was the story I Am Legend. It was published in 1952. And for those of you who have seen the movie but haven't read the book, it's not exactly zombie fiction per se, the novel. It's actually sort of vampire fiction, but the idea is that the vampires have kind of died and then they come back as vampires, which is a little bit different than the movie. But this isn't really important to zombie culture because George Romero himself actually said that I Am Legend, the novel, was what inspired Dawn of the Dead. So speaking of George Romero, he, if you haven't heard of him before, is pretty much responsible for making zombies into a really big thing in the United States. He directed the Night of the Living Dead movie in 1968, and then it had 5 sequel films. And these films were a huge hit, super huge to really developing that zombie culture in the United States. And since then, as a result, zombies have appeared in a ton of different forms. Video games, for example, there's plenty of video game series that are based entirely off of zombies, survival, that sort of thing. A favorite of mine is Call of Duty. Call of Duty actually has a Nazi zombies add-on to it that I find really interesting. In addition, I found an article talking about music that's kind of devoted to zombies. Not necessarily just a band, but there's a genre of music called horror punk, and it focuses on just basically horror themes, including zombies. Zombies are also featured in art. For example, if you go on Instagram and type in zombies, I did this a while back, and tons of artwork, both professional and amateur artwork. And then also zombie television shows. Probably the most popular example of that would include The Walking Dead. I did a little bit of research to see how big The Walking Dead has become, and the ratings for one of their episodes came up to 18 million viewers. So I would certainly say that The Walking Dead is a current mainstream example of what's really popular in zombies right now. So now I want to see how The Walking Dead measures up to World War Z, what differences there is, because if Walking Dead is what mainstream is for zombies right now, If World War Z is postmodern, then it should be a little bit different in certain forms, even though it might share a couple similarities. There's not a huge time gap between the two. World War Z was published in 2006. The comics for The Walking Dead started in 2003, and the TV show aired in 2010. Now I'm going to show a bit of an interview with a friend of mine. Her name's Maddie. She is a huge Walking Dead fan, has a ton of knowledge about the series, so I figured I'd ask her some questions and kind of see how things measured up. She's going to talk about The Walking Dead a little bit, and then I'm going to compare a little bit with World War Z to see what differences and similarities there are.
Yes. Do I need to explain more on that?
The way that World War Z is set up is an extremely unique approach to storytelling. It's set up as a sequence of interviews, which is kind of odd, especially for a story about zombies, because it gives it a sort of almost documentary style feeling, which is kind of odd because we don't think of documentaries as being a fictional thing. That's usually something that we use to learn about something. And so to have a documentary style feeling for World War Z is certainly a unique aspect, and one that I would say definitely lends to making it pretty different from mainstream zombie culture.
Survival and sticking together, being family, how people can turn on each other. There's always someone who will snap and be the bad guy, and then there's always someone who will be the leader. And then zombies, so death. Death is definitely a present theme in Walking Dead.
There are definitely some similar themes between The Walking Dead and World War Z. For example, death and survival are both evident in each work. There's also commentary on classism in World War Z. For example, when the story mentions that there were celebrities and other rich people in a fortress that had armed guards protecting them, that all of a sudden, almost out of nowhere, a bunch of common people come and take over the fortress, and the main character of that interview decides to just leave because he realizes that the people aren't necessarily bad people, and that he's not really a huge fan of the rich people that he's there protecting. So there was certainly some commentary about classism there with these common people and these rich people, and who's better, what really makes them different essentially, what's the point of judging people that way. There's also a lot talking about racism in World War Z. The perfect example of this is when boats are leaving and they're saying that they will only accept certain races on board, so they'll only take white people. If you're not white, don't bother. And in the midst of this, zombies are attacking, pulling people off the rafts, killing people. And for some crazy reason, racism is playing a huge role in who's going to get away. There's also examples of PTSD, which I think if you've seen The Walking Dead or read the comics, you'll see that also. But the perfect example of this is the girl who heard a voice over a radio that may or may not have actually existed. The girl who she crashed in the helicopter, and then she was hearing a voice telling her what she needed to do to escape, but she may not have actually been hearing a voice for real. It might have been fake, but the story doesn't necessarily say one way or another. There's also mentions of global conflict that exists today in the real world when the Palestinian character, he says that he doesn't at first believe that the dead are rising and believes that Israel's pulling a trick. That's certainly commentary on how that sort of attitude exists today between Palestinians and Israeli people. And I think that what Brooks is trying to get at is that a lot of this is kind of pointless. And he throws them in this really intense situation where they have to survive together to realize that in the end we're all just people, and that some of these things that divide us shouldn't exist. And I think that that's a super important theme that Brooks really wants his audience to take away from the story.
Ooh, that's fun. A lot of zombie material, it's all about the death and just all about the killing. And Walking Dead, there's a lot of story. There's a lot of like backstory and just human relations, and to me it's more about how people interact with each other instead of how zombies interact with the people.
In general, something that's really unique to World War Z is that it takes a cultural look at the apocalypse. The Walking Dead is almost solely based in the US, although Fear the Walking Dead is in Mexico for now, but it may not stay there for very long. In addition, World War Z focuses on different groups of people, following each person for a short period of time. So we don't follow the same person throughout the entire story. It's just all these small little stories about different people. But that worldwide view is super unique to World War Z, and something that I personally found really interesting is the idea of how will each country react to the zombie apocalypse. It's not something that you normally see in a zombie movie or a zombie book or anything like that, because it's hard to cover everything. And that's the entire point of World War Z, and that's why they're able to pull it off so successfully.
Ooh, it's hard. Intense, I would say. There's not really any episodes or even comic issues where everything's okay. There are some things that are better, like they find different communities or different people, but still they're in a zombie apocalypse and nothing's really the same as it was.
The tone of World War Z is really interesting. At least in my opinion, it's pretty different from horror in general. Mostly because we're hearing a story from someone who's being interviewed, so we know that that person survived, or else they wouldn't be giving the interview. And so it kind of kills the suspense a little bit, but it also shifts the emphasis on the story. So when you're hearing the story, you're not necessarily thinking, oh man, are they going to survive, or are they going to die? That's not really the point of the story. And I think so often in the horror genre, especially with movies, the idea is, oh no, are these characters going to survive? There's not really a super deep meaning. It's just zombies come and kill everybody. Werewolves come and try to kill everybody. So all these different creatures, and the emphasis is really on the monsters themselves. Whereas with something like World War Z, when it's not just about does this guy survive, you can kind of explore different themes a little bit. So I think that that's probably one of the biggest ways that World War Z distances itself from other zombie culture.
Oh, that's such a good question. um, how how the characters handle situations. Because there's people like the governor who, like, something bad happens to him and he just freaks out on everybody. And then there's people like Glenn where he really struggles with, do I kill this person or do I not? Which he didn't kill anybody till season 6. Fun fact. And then, especially like Rick, there's like the whole Rick and Shane thing, like, how do I handle this person who's my best friend and he's a good person, but he's snapped and he's turned and he's terrorizing the group. And so it's really just the situations that the characters are put in and then how they handle them. And what it does to them also. So
Morality is definitely another really interesting aspect of World War Z, especially when you take into consideration the implementation of the Rediker Plan. Now, The Walking Dead certainly does look at morality in a variety of situations, but I don't really think it has anything quite like the Rediker Plan. So just kind of a reminder, the Rediker Plan was the idea that certain safe zones would be set up and filled with people, but they would be used almost as live bait to protect other hidden away safe zones with, I guess, more important and larger groups of people. And the idea was that those decoys were worth the lives of everyone else. But something that's really interesting is that Rediker himself actually struggles with the implementation of that plan later on in his life. And the book mentions that it takes a huge emotional toll on him, even though he tries to hide from emotion for the majority of his life. The book also does a great job of exploring how the Rediker Plan affects people personally. It takes the perspective of a soldier who has to abandon a town and fall back to a safe zone. The citizens of the town get really upset when the soldiers are leaving, but the soldiers do it anyway, although they don't feel great about it. So it's interesting commentary do the ends justify the means here? Are we going to sacrifice 1,000 people to save 1,000,000? Is that something that we can justify? And I don't know that the book necessarily gives us an answer, even though they say that Rediker feels bad about it. It doesn't necessarily say whether or not the decision was right, although it does allude that the decision was ultimately played a big role in helping the people survive and take back their land from the zombies. So ultimately, whether or not it was the right thing to do is kind of up to the reader, which is an interesting thing because for me, at least personally, I can look in that and I can think to myself, do I find that personally justifiable or not? And so it's interesting that World War Z is getting you to think about morality in that sense.
I really, really want to say yes, but I don't I don't think so. Just because it's really hard to have a happy ending when there's dead people all around. You know, I mean, I want to say that, like, they figure out a cure and they cure all the zombies, or at least kill all the zombies, and everyone lives happily ever after. But even if that is the case, then still 90% of the world is dead. And so, I mean, there still can be, like, repopulating and everything, but I just don't see it. I mean, at least not for Rick's group. It may be a happy ending for, like, Carl's children, but no.
Happy ending is kind of an interesting topic in World War Z. Similar to what Maddie said, so many people are dead after this event has happened. But the feeling that the book gives me is that World War Z is ultimately a happy ending, in that we've learned from this experience. Now we're less prejudiced as a people overall. We're taking back the world, and people are going to stand together in the future against the zombie threat. So it's sort of a happy ending in a sense, even though all those people have died. Humanity, in theory, is coming back stronger. But Walking Dead, and this is one of those big differences, I don't, like Maddie said, I don't see it ending with a happy ending, especially for those of you who don't know, who aren't following The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead, basically the idea is that everybody's infected and that when you die, you turn into a zombie, and that there's not a lot you can do about that. So with that, it doesn't really seem like there can be a Walking Dead happy ending to me personally, which is one way that it's different than World War Z. And I think that that's an interesting concept. I think that that really separates Walking Dead from a lot of other popular zombie and other monster genres, because typically with the movie you'll have some kind of happy ending. They defeat the monster at the end of the movie, everything's great, everybody's happy. And even World War Z sort of has that, which is kind of interesting because I think that idea of no happy ending, if World War Z were to end with everybody dying, I think that would be really postmodern, because that's not what you're expecting at the end of a novel. Although World War Z does seem to have that sort of happy ending, even though it's still kind of somber because so many people have died. So kind of in conclusion, does World War Z live up to the idea of postmodern work? Personally, I would say that yeah, it does. The structure is really unique to anything we're seeing in zombie culture with the whole interview thing. The huge cultural look is a really big difference between it and, say, The Walking Dead. And some of the themes it explores are pretty different, at least for now. It'll be interesting to see how the zombie genre in general moves forward from here. Although it is kind of weird to think that World War Z is now actually 10 years old. But it'll be interesting to see how things move forward from here, and maybe people will look back one day on World War Z and see that, oh yeah, at the time that was kind of revolutionary to the way that the horror genre worked in general. And so moving forward, it'll be interesting to see what impact it has on the zombie genre. If it has any, maybe it doesn't. Maybe the zombie genre will take a completely different approach in the future. It'll be interesting to find out though, and I think that ultimately, yes, World War Z does a great job of being postmodern. It's different, it sets itself apart, and ultimately it works and it makes you think. And I think those are important things for a novel to do.